Literary criticism is the study, evaluation, and interpretation of literature. Modern literary criticism is often influenced by literary theory, which is the philosophical discussion of its methods and goals. Though the two activities are closely related, literary critics are not always, and have not always been, theorists. Whether or not literary criticism should be considered a separate field of inquiry from literary theory, or conversely from book reviewing, is a matter of some controversy. For example, the Johns Hopkins Guide to Literary Theory and Criticism draws no distinction between literary theory and literary criticism, and almost always uses the terms together to describe the same concept. Some critics consider literary criticism a practical application of literary theory, because criticism always deals directly with particular literary works, while theory may be more general or abstract. Literary criticism is often published in essay or book form. Academic literary critics teach in literature departments and publish in academic journals, and more popular critics publish their criticism in broadly circulating periodicals such as the Times Literary Supplement, the New York Times Book Review, the New York Review of Books, the London Review of Books, The Nation, and the New Yorker. History of literary criticism. Aristotle's Poetics clearly defines aspects of literature and introduces many literary terms still used today. Classical and medieval criticism. Literary criticism has probably existed for as long as literature. In the 4th century BC, Aristotle wrote the Poetics, a typology and description of literary forms with many specific criticisms of contemporary works of art. Poetics developed for the first time the concepts of mimesis and catharsis, which are still crucial in literary study. Plato's attacks on poetry as imitative, secondary, and false were formative as well. Around the same time, Bharata Muni, in his Natya Shastra, wrote literary criticism on ancient Indian literature and Sanskrit drama. Later classical and medieval criticism often focused on religious texts, and the several long religious traditions of hermeneutics and textual exegesis have had a profound influence on the study of secular texts. This was particularly the case for the literary traditions of the three Abrahamic religions, Jewish literature, Christian literature and Islamic literature. Literary criticism was also employed in other forms of medieval Arabic literature and Arabic poetry from the 9th century, notably by al-Jawzi in his al-Bayan wa al-Tabi'in and al-Haywan, and by Abdullah ibn al-Mutaz in his Kitab al-Badi. Key texts. Renaissance criticism. The literary criticism of the Renaissance developed classical ideas of unity of form and content into literary neoclassicism, proclaiming literature as central to culture, entrusting the poet and the author with preservation of a long literary tradition. The birth of Renaissance criticism was in 1498, with the recovery of classic texts, most notably, Giorgio Vala's Latin translation of Aristotle's Poetics. The work of Aristotle, especially Poetics, was the most important influence upon literary criticism until the late 18th century. Lodovico Castelvetro was one of the most influential Renaissance critics who wrote commentaries on Aristotle's Poetics in 1570. Key texts. Lodovico Castelvetro, The Poetics of Aristotle translated and explained. Philip Sidney, An Apology for Poetry. Jacopo Mazzoni, On the Defense of the Comedy of Dante. Torquato Tasso, Discourses on the Heroic Poem. Francis Bacon, The Advancement of Learning. Henry Reynolds, Mygamists. John Mandeville, composed in the mid-14th century, most probably by a French physician. Enlightenment criticism. Key texts. 19th century criticism. The British Romantic movement of the early 19th century introduced new aesthetic ideas to literary study, including the idea that the object of literature need not always be beautiful, noble, or perfect, but that literature itself could elevate a common subject to the level of the sublime. German Romanticism, which followed closely after the late development of German classicism, emphasized an aesthetic of fragmentation that can appear startlingly modern to the reader of English literature, and valued wit's that is, wit, or humor of a certain sort more highly than the serious Anglophone Romanticism. The late 19th century brought renown to authors known more for critical writing than for their own literary work, such as Matthew Arnold. Key texts. The New Criticism, However important all of these aesthetic movements were as antecedents, current ideas about literary criticism derive almost entirely from the new direction taken in the early 20th century. Early in the century the school of criticism known as Russian formalism, and slightly later the new criticism in Britain and in the United States, came to dominate the study and discussion of literature, in the English-speaking world. Both schools emphasized the close reading of texts, elevating it far above generalizing discussion and speculation about either authorial intention or reader response. This emphasis on form and precise attention to the words themselves has persisted, after the decline of these critical doctrines themselves. Theory. In 1957 Northrop Frye published the influential Anatomy of Criticism. In his works Frye noted that some critics tend to embrace an ideology, and to judge literary pieces on the basis of their adherence to such ideology. This has been a highly influential viewpoint among modern conservative thinkers. E. Michael Jones, for example, argues in his Degenerate Moderns that Stanley Fish was influenced by his adulterous affairs to reject classic literature that condemned adultery. In the British and American literary establishment, the new criticism was more or less dominant until the late 1960s. Around that time Anglo-American university literature departments began to witness a rise of a more explicitly philosophical literary theory, influenced by structuralism, then post-structuralism, and other kinds of continental philosophy. It continued until the mid-1980s, when interest in theory peaked. Many later critics, though undoubtedly still influenced by theoretical work, have been comfortable simply interpreting literature rather than writing explicitly about methodology and philosophical presumptions. Key 20th century texts. History of the book. Related to other forms of literary criticism, the history of the book is a field of interdisciplinary inquiry drawing on the methods of bibliography, cultural history, history of literature, and media theory. Principally concerned with the production, circulation, and reception of texts and their material forms, book history seeks to connect forms of textuality with their material aspects. Among the issues within the history of literature with which book history can be seen to intersect are, the development of authorship as a profession, the formation of reading audiences, the constraints of censorship and copyright, and the economics of literary form. The current state of literary criticism. Today interest in literary theory and continental philosophy coexists in university literature departments with a more conservative literary criticism of which the new critics would probably have approved. Disagreements over the goals and methods of literary criticism, which characterized both sides taken by critics during the rise of theory, have declined. Many critics feel that they now have a great plurality of methods and approaches from which to choose. Some critics work largely with theoretical texts, while others read traditional literature. Interest in the literary canon is still great, but many critics are also interested in minority and women's literatures, while some critics influenced by cultural studies read popular texts like comic books or pulp genre fiction. Critics have drawn connections between literature and the natural sciences. Darwinian literary studies studies literature in the context of evolutionary influences on human nature. Many literary critics also work in film criticism or media studies. Some write intellectual history. Others bring the results and methods of social history to bear on reading literature. Questions to the value of academic criticism. The value of literary criticism has been questioned by some prominent artists. Vladimir Nabokov argued that good readers don't read books, and particularly literary masterpieces, for the academic purpose of indulging in generalizations. Stephen J. Joyce, grandson of James Joyce, at a 1986 academic conference of Joyceans in Copenhagen, said if my grandfather was here, he would have died laughing. Dubliners and A portrait of the artist as a young man can be picked up, read, and enjoyed by virtually anybody without scholarly guides, theories, and intricate explanations, as can Ulysses, if you forget about all the hue and cry. And he questioned whether anything has been added to the legacy of Joyce's art by the 261 books of literary criticism stored in the Library of Congress. See also, literary critics, comparative literature, genre studies, history of the book, literary translation, Poetic tradition, philosophy and literature, translation criticism, references. External links. Dictionary of the History of Ideas, Literary Criticism, Truman Capote Award for Literary Criticism Award winners, Internet Public Library, Literary Criticism collection of critical and biographical websites, a bibliography of literary theory, criticism, and philology.